Right, hello there. Welcome to the show, or, well, this particular corner of the internet where we try to make sense of things that, frankly, often make very little sense at all. And tonight, or today, or whenever you're consuming this digital morsel, we're looking north to our lovely syrup-producing, overly polite neighbors in Canada. Now, Canada, bless their cotton socks, occasionally does things that ruffle feathers, and in this instance they implemented a new border facilitation levy, which is just a fancy way of saying toll, on goods crossing into their territory. A perfectly normal sovereign nation thing to do, if a bit annoying for exporters. But of course, when this happened during the tenure of a man whose approach to international diplomacy was less chess and more throwing the board at a pigeon, the response was, shall we say, suboptimal. It was like watching a toddler try to assemble IKEA furniture with a sledgehammer, loud, ineffective, and someone's definitely going to cry. And that someone, metaphorically speaking, was often the delicate fabric of international trade relations and quite possibly anyone who had to listen to the ensuing pronouncements. So, let's put on our waders because things are about to get murky and predictably absurd. Today we're diving into the three major mistakes former President Trump made in response to Canada's toll move. Stay tuned to find out how these missteps could have been avoided, assuming of course that the primary goal was something other than, say, aggressively alienating one of our closest allies over what amounted to a customs fee. It's a wild ride, so buckle up, let's get started. So, Canada rolls out this new border facilitation levy. Now, any sensible administration would probably ask, what's the scope of this levy? Which sectors will it impact most? What's the projected economic effect on U.S. businesses? But that, it seems, was not the chosen path. Instead, the Trump administration appeared to shrug it off. The economic impact? Minimal, they probably thought. This, my friends, is mistake number one. Underestimating the economic impact. It's a classic blunder, like invading Russia in winter. The assumption was that Canada's economic policies would have minimal consequences for the U.S. Spoiler alert, that's not how economics works. Increased costs for U.S. exporters meant higher prices at the border. These costs either get passed on to Canadian consumers or absorbed by U.S. businesses. For small businesses, this was a genuine headache. The Trump administration's downplaying of this, like a doctor calling a broken leg a flesh wound. This underestimation was a fundamental misunderstanding of our interconnected economies. It's the butterfly effect, but with more tariffs and less poetry. The problem with underestimating economic impacts is that it leads to a delayed or inadequate response. It's like ignoring a small leak in your roof. Leave it unattended, and soon you're dealing with water damage and mold. The initial Canadian levy might have been a small drip, but the failure to gauge its potential was a significant misstep. It was about the signal it sent and the potential for escalation. If the U.S. response is perceived as weak, what's to stop further measures? Underestimating the impact emboldens others and weakens your negotiating position. It's basic game theory, if the game was played by someone who'd only read the first page of the rulebook. The U.S. economy, particularly in border states, has intricate supply chains deeply intertwined with Canada. Businesses in states like Michigan, New York, or Washington rely on a smooth, predictable flow of goods. Introducing a new, underestimated cost factor throws a wrench into those systems. It creates uncertainty, and businesses hate uncertainty more than a vampire hates a garlic-themed tanning salon. The narrative that this was no big deal ignored the cumulative effect of such measures. One small toll might be manageable. But international trade is often a game of inches, of small advantages. If this levy was part of a broader trend, the collective impact could become substantial. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts, or in this case, 1,000 border facilitation levies. The Canadian government wouldn't have implemented this levy without doing their own calculations. They would have assessed the potential U.S. reaction and the likely economic fallout. To assume they hadn't was to underestimate the strategic thinking of a key trading partner. It's like playing poker against someone you assume is bluffing, only to find out they're holding a royal flush. The failure here was a failure of foresight and detailed analysis. It set the stage for a reactive rather than proactive approach. It's the diplomatic equivalent of only starting to study for the exam the night before. This underestimation also meant that any subsequent actions would seem disproportionate. If you start threatening massive retaliatory tariffs, people are going to wonder if you've completely lost the plot. Which, to be fair, was a question that came up rather frequently during those years. Alright, so we've established that the initial assessment of Canada's border facilitation levy was, shall we say, a triumph of optimism over economic reality. This is fine dog in a burning room moment. This naturally leads us to mistake number 2, the utter, baffling and frankly quite dangerous failure to consult actual trade experts. Because, and this might shock you, there are people whose entire careers are dedicated to understanding the intricate dance of international commerce. Now, in any normal functioning government, when a trade issue arises with a major partner like Canada, the first call you'd make would be to your trade wonks. You'd summon the folks from the U.S. Trade Representative's office, the Commerce Department, seasoned economists, industry liaisons, people who actually trade agreements for fun, or well, for work. These are the individuals who can tell you the difference between a tariff and a non-tariff barrier, who understand the legal implications under WTO rules or existing bilateral agreements like the USMCA. They can model economic impacts, identify leverage points for negotiation, and, crucially, advise on how to accidentally set your own trousers on fire while trying to look tough. But the Trump administration, as we all vividly recall, had a somewhat idiosyncratic relationship with expertise. It was often viewed with the same suspicion one might reserve for a vegan at a Texas barbecue. Experts were frequently dismissed as globalists, elites, or simply people who knew too many facts for their own good. The prevailing wisdom seemed to be that gut instinct and a strong Twitter game were sufficient substitutes for decades of specialized knowledge. So when Canada introduced its levy, instead of a careful, expert-led analysis, the decision-making process likely resembled a game of policy pinball, bouncing between impulsive reactions and pronouncements made without the inconvenient ballast of, evidence or strategic foresight. Consult trade experts? Why would we do that? I have a very good brain one can almost hear being uttered in a room somewhere, possibly while someone else was frantically trying to find Canada on a map. This failure to consult, or perhaps the willful ignorance of any advice offered, meant that the US response was flying blind. It's like trying to perform surgery using a butter knife and a YouTube tutorial you only half watched. The chances of a successful outcome are, to put it mildly, slim. And the patient in this case is the US economy and its relationship with a critical ally. Trade experts could have provided crucial context. They could have explained, for instance, whether Canada's levy was a legitimate cost recovery measure for improved border infrastructure, which countries are allowed to do, or a disguised protectionist tactic. They could have analyzed its precise impact on specific American industries, identifying who would be hurt most and what kind of targeted support or negotiation might be needed. They could have also advised on the appropriate channels for dispute resolution. There are mechanisms within trade agreements specifically designed to handle these kinds of disagreements. These processes are often slow and bureaucratic, yes, but they exist to prevent minor spats from escalating into full-blown trade wars. They are the diplomatic equivalent of a timeout chair for squabbling nations. But to use them, you first have to they exist, and their purpose. Instead, by sidelining the experts, the administration risked misinterpreting Canada's motives, miscalculating the stakes, and choosing retaliatory measures that were either ineffective, disproportionately harmful to US interests, or legally questionable. It's the policy equivalent of ready, fire, aim, except they probably skipped the ready part too. Imagine the seen career trade negotiators, people who've spent years understanding the nuances of Canadian trade policy, sitting in their offices watching the news unfold, possibly banging their heads repeatedly against their desks. If only they'd asked us, they might have sighed. We could have told them this was a terrible idea. But the call, it seems, often never came. Or if it did, the advice was filed under suggestions to ignore. This disdain for expert advice wasn't just an oversight. It was a core feature of the administration's approach. It stemmed from a belief that established norms and institutions were part of the problem, and that a disruptive go-it-alone strategy was the only way to win. The problem is, in international trade, winning often looks a lot like mutual benefit and stable, predictable relationships, not a zero-sum game where one side has to be crushed. The consequences of this failure are manifold. Firstly, it leads to poorly designed policy. Without expert input, you're more likely to impose tariffs on goods that disproportionately harm your own consumers or businesses that rely on imported components. You might pick fights you can't win, or escalate disputes unnecessarily because you don't understand the other side's red lines or the potential for unintended consequences. Secondly, it damages morale and capacity within the government itself. Chapter 3. Mistake number 3. The diplomatic subtlety of a monster truck rally, now with more tweets. And so, we arrive at the grand finale of our trilogy of trade-related faceplants. Mistake number 3. Aggressive rhetoric and the ensuing diplomatic fallout. Because after you've underestimated the economic impact and comprehensively ignored anyone who might actually understand the situation, the logical next step, apparently, is to start shouting. Preferably through an unverified social media account directly at one of your oldest and closest allies. Now, diplomacy traditionally is a delicate art. It involves careful wording, back-channel communications, and a general understanding that you're trying to build bridges, not burn them down with a flamethrower of ill-advised insults. The Trump administration's approach to Canada, particularly when faced with something like this new border facilitation levy, often felt less like diplomacy and more like a wrestling promo. All that was missing was a folding chair and someone yelling, "Can you smell what the Donald is cooking?" It was usually just burnt toast, metaphorically speaking. Instead of a measured, diplomatic inquiry or a firm but respectful statement of concern, the response to Canada's move was likely characterized by the kind of aggressive rhetoric that became a hallmark of the era. Think public denunciations, threats of disproportionate retaliation, and of course the inevitable barrage of tweets. Tweets that probably called Canadian leaders weak or dishonest or accused Canada of ripping off the United States for decades, all because of a border levy that experts, had they been consulted, might have explained was relatively routine. This kind of rhetoric is not just unhelpful, it's actively damaging. Canada, despite its polite reputation, is a sovereign nation with its own national pride and interests. Being publicly berated and threatened by its much larger neighbor doesn't tend to make them more compliant. It makes them dig in their heels. It turns a manageable trade dispute into a matter of national dignity. Suddenly, backing down isn't just an economic calculation, it's a political impossibility for Canadian leaders who don't want to be seen kowtowing to a bully. Imagine you have a minor disagreement with your neighbor about a fence line. The sensible approach is to have a calm conversation, maybe consult the property deeds. The Trumpian approach would be to hold a press conference on your lawn, call your neighbor names, threaten to build a 10-foot wall topped with angry badgers, and then tweet about how unfair your neighbor is being. It doesn't solve the fence issue, and now your neighbor hates you. That, in essence, was often the US-Canada dynamic. The diplomatic fallout from this kind of aggressive posturing is significant. Firstly, it erodes trust. Alliances are built on trust and the expectation of mutual respect. When one partner consistently resorts to public attacks and bullying tactics, that trust evaporates. Canadian officials, and indeed officials from other allied nations, become wary of engaging with an administration that might turn on them at any moment for domestic political gain, or simply out of pique. Secondly, it undermines U.S. leadership on the world stage. How can the U.S. credibly call for international cooperation or adherence to a rules-based order when its own leader is trashing allies and threatening unilateral actions over relatively minor issues? It makes the U.S. look erratic and unreliable, diminishing its ability to rally support for more significant global challenges. It's hard to lead the free world when you're busy having a Twitter spat with Justin Trudeau over milk tariffs or, in this case, a border levy. Thirdly, it creates an opening for actual adversaries. When the U.S. is busy alienating its friends, countries like China or Russia are more than happy to see those alliances weakened. They benefit from a West that is divided and distracted by internal squabbles. So in a very real sense, this aggressive rhetoric wasn't just bad for US-Canada relations. It was strategically short-sighted in a much broader geopolitical context. The language used often seemed designed to provoke rather than persuade. Calling a key trading partner meek and mild in one breath and then accusing them of taking advantage in the next is not a coherent negotiating strategy. It's just confusing and insulting. It's like trying to train a dog by alternately petting it and then yelling at it for reasons it can't possibly understand. You just end up with a very confused and anxious dog, or in this case, a very confused and anxious G7 ally. This approach also ignored the deep people-to-people ties and shared values between the US and Canada.